So, as I say, let's start with the Constitution. And I think it's important to remember that, or to note that the original provisions of the Constitution, I'm talking about the document that was drafted by the Philadelphia Convention in the summer of 1787, submitted to the states and ratified, took effect in 1789, only made indirect references to the slaves and slavery. Okay? In fact, two, to be precise. The first comes in Article 1, Section 2, which reads, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, blah, 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 to 3/5. There's some other language in there, just leaving it out for the sake of efficiency, right? To 3/5 of all other persons. This is the famous 3/5 compromise. You probably remember reading about that in the textbook. There's some discussion of that, right? Who wanted the slaves to be counted in terms of census? Southerners generally, okay? The slaveholding states. Why did they want slaves to be counted?
To get more say in the Senate.
How? Well, when you say the Senate and Congress, keep in mind that the United States Congress has two chambers. One is called the United States House of Representatives. The other is called the United States Senate. People do that all the time. I understand. It's quite common. Don't worry about it. But just, kind of try to, train yourself to think about Congress as having two chambers. One is the House of Representatives. The other is the Senate. So which of the two would be directly affected by this provision? The House of Representatives, right? Because each state has the same number of senators, right? Each state has two senators. The number of representatives that are apportioned to each state is based on the population of the state. So the slaveholding states would have wanted the slaves to be counted as part of the population. That would have increased their population and therefore would have increased the number of representatives they would have had in the House, and that would have given them more influence vis-a-vis the non-slaveholding states, right? Vis-a-vis Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and New York, right? Okay? And obviously the opposite side of the coin is true for the northern states. They didn't want slaves to be counted. By the way, just a quick aside. You probably don't need me to draw your attention to this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Does it strike you as odd, passing odd, that the Southerners at the Constitutional Convention who wanted the slaves to be counted as persons for the purposes of enumerating or apportioning the House of Representatives wanted slaves to be counted as property for every other purpose? Count them, they're property. Okay, until we're talking about apportioning the House of Representatives, now we want to count them as persons. By the way, that language that we see in the Constitution that provides that persons are going to be counted for the purposes of the census also comes back to bite conservatives, not necessarily exclusively in the South, but to a large extent today. Because what is the application of that today? Notice it doesn't say count citizens. And in the 14th Amendment, for example, it doesn't say that in the Equal Protection Clause, which we'll get to here in just a few minutes, it doesn't say all citizens within their jurisdiction. It says persons, right? So the implication of that today, with respect, say, to the immigration question, has some pretty significant impacts, right? So presumably when the United States Census Bureau does its census in 2020, it has to count every person, whether or not the person is a citizen or not a citizen, right? For the purposes of making important decisions like how many representatives will Texas have in the United States House of Representatives? How many representatives will California have in the United States House of Representatives? Anyway, I don't want to digress on that point. Okay, so that's the first provision. Again, not an effort to directly deal with the issue of slavery, just sort of a peripheral kind of issue. And then the second one, Article 1, Section 9, says the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. And that simply means that Congress cannot impose any restrictions on the slave trade before the year 1808. When was the Constitution written again? 1787, right? So essentially they're pushing this issue into the future for at least 20 years, right? They're saying, or the expression that you hear a lot, politicians use today, kicking the can down the road, right? They're kicking the can down the road 20 years. I wonder what motivated that. Let me ask you this. Do you think that there were present at the Constitutional Convention, or at least at the time of the Constitutional Convention, any delegates at the convention or other leading American statesmen who would have abolished slavery if they had it within their power to do that? Were there any abolitionists at the time that the Constitution was written? Yes, there were. Some very significant Americans who were opposed to slavery, found the institution of slavery morally repugnant. John Jay, for example, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers and the first Supreme Court Justice of the United States, wrote extensively in opposition to slavery. Patrick Henry, who wasn't at the Constitutional Convention, but certainly was a leading American statesman of that era, one of the prominent figures of the Revolution, was an outspoken critic of the institution of slavery.